Okay, so this is chapter 7, which is the skeletal system. Things are going to start to get, I think they get easier. So we've kind of front end loaded the hard stuff. So skeletal system will be easier. We're going to talk about the parts of the skeletal system and the functions. Okay, so the bones are the primary organs of the skeletal system. They're going to provide a framework and protection for the body, but they have lots of other functions. The skeletal system has other function as well. Okay, so the types of bone. So the two main types of bone are compact bone and spongy bone. So compact bone can also be called dense or cortical bone, and it's 80% of the mass of the bone in your body. So most of the weight of your body is going to be due to compact bone. Okay, the spongy bone is the bone that's internal or deeper inside the bone and inside the compact bone. Okay, it looks porous or spongy, and it's 20% of the bone mass. Okay, sometimes they call it trabecular or cancellous. I usually have heard this one. I've never heard that one. Okay, so now cartilage is connective tissue, which you guys know, it's way more flexible than bone. So it's called semi-rigid. There's two types of cartilage that are important here. So there's hyaline cartilage. Hyaline cartilage, what it's going to do is it's going to attach your ribs to your sternum. Okay, so we'll go like this. So if here's your sternum and your ribs are coming around, hyaline cartilage is going to connect them here. We'll go over that. It covers the ends of some bones. So if like this is a femur, it might be at the ends of it. It's within growth plates, and it's used as a model or kind of like a template or scaffolding for when we start to make bone. Okay, the second cut, so it's kind of smooth. I always think of it as kind of like Teflon. Okay, so it covers the ends to keep things smooth, but it also can be strong, right? And it holds things together. Fibrocartilage is weight bearing. Okay, so it's going to withstand compression. It's in places where there's going to be pressure. So it's in between the vertebral discs or the vertebrae, or it is the vertebral discs. It's in between the vertebrae. It's in the front of the pelvis at the pubic symphysis. So that's just like in the pubic area. And we'll go over we'll go over the anatomy of the bone, so you'll see that. It's also what makes up the meniscus that's in your knee. Okay, so if it's kind of like in here, this is in, well, that's not a good picture. So pretend this is the bottom bone of your knee and this is the top one. Okay, it's in between there. Okay, now ligaments connect bone to bone. Okay, so I remember ligaments do like things. Okay, so bone to bone, and tendons do connect two things because of the T, so they connect muscle to bone. Okay, so ligaments do like, so they're going to connect bone to bone, and tendons hook muscle to bone. Okay, so here is a picture of cartilage in the adult and juvenile skeleton. Okay, so cartilage is going to be, you can see the costal cartilage, it's hooking the ribs to the sternum. There's articular cartilage, which is at the joints, okay, where the meniscus is in between, and then it's also in between the vertebral discs. Okay, in the juvenile skeleton that's just developing, you're going to have cartilage between the ends of the bone and the long part of the bone. Okay, we also have cartilage. So there's another picture. The articular cartilage is at the ends. Okay, so that's going to reduce friction. Okay, now general functions of the skeletal system. So support and protection. Okay, so it keeps you upright. And you don't really think about it, but it's protecting all of your vital organs. So if you think about your skull, it's protecting your brain, and your rib cage is protecting your heart and your lungs. So it's protection. Okay, that it's levers so you can move. Okay, so hemopoiesis is blood cell production. Okay, so blood cell production is really important. That's how we stay alive. It's how we transport our oxygen and our waste. Okay, so we have to have We have to have blood cells. Blood cell production occurs in the red bone marrow. It also acts as a place, the skeletal system also acts as a place where we can store calcium and phosphate. Okay, now when we classify bones, there are 4 classes and they're determined by the shape. Okay, so there are long bones, so they're longer than they are wide. So the femur and the humerus, and you don't know those yet because they're in lab and we do them next week. There are short bones, so their length is equal to the width. So those are the bones in our hands and our wrists and our feet, so the carpals and the tarsals. There are flat bones, so they're usually pretty thin and flat. The cranial bones, so the bones of your skull, are flat. Okay, and then we have irregular bones, and sometimes they're very they're saying elaborate. Okay, so they're not simple, they're kind of look complex. An example of that would be the vertebrae. Okay, so here's some classification. So here's a flat bone, here's irregular, long bones would be your femur, okay, and then short bones are the bones in your feet and your hands. Okay, now if we look at the anatomy of a bone, okay, so here are the regions. So I'll go over these and then I'll point to the picture. Okay, so the diaphysis is the shaft. Okay, so if we go here, oh shoot, okay. The diaphysis, that's the long part, the shaft of the bone, okay, so the long cylindrical shaft, it's pretty much compact bone, but in the middle, it can be spongy. Okay, the medullary cavity is going to be in the middle. I wish I had a picture here to show you, but let me try to draw it. Okay, so here's the diaphysis. Okay, and then in there is going to be the medullary cavity. Okay, if you're a kid, you have red bone marrow in the medullary cavity, but as we age, we end up with fat in there, so yellow bone marrow. Okay, the epiphysis, if I draw my picture again, the epiphysis is the ends. Okay, proximal epiphysis is going to be closest to the trunk of the body and the distal is further away. Okay, now at the end of the epiphysis, okay, that's where we're going to have it covered with the articular cartilage. So it's hyaline cartilage, it's reduces friction, okay, and it can absorb some shock in joints that are moving. Okay, now the metaphysis, okay, is in between the diaphysis and the epiphysis, which seems kind of like, oh yeah, that's logical, right? Okay, so here's the epiphysis, right? Here's the diaphysis. So in here, in these regions, that's the metaphysis. Okay, now, when you are growing, okay, you have in this metaphysis area, you have what they call an epiphyseal plate. It's also known as the growth plate. So in here is a layer of hyaline cartilage, and that's how we're going to grow. We're going to grow the cartilage and push the ends down and make the bone longer. Okay, after you finish growing, okay, we have a remnant of the epiphysis or of the growth plate, and that's called the epiphyseal line. Okay, so here is a picture. Okay, so here's the proximal epiphysis, the end, articular cartilage. There's some spongy bone, so it looks like a sponge. Okay, there's articular cartilage at the end. Okay, medullary cavity. And then here is a line. So this is an adult bone. So the epiphyseal line is kind of like right in there. I don't know if you guys can see it. Let me try to highlight it. So it's right in there. Okay, and that's metaphysis. So the epiphyseal line or the epiphyseal plate are part of the metaphysis, which is a weird word to say. Okay, now if we start looking at the coverings and the linings of the bone, okay, we're going to start with the periosteum. Okay, so the periosteum is the outside layer. Okay, so it's denser, regular connective tissue. So what it does is it protects the bone and it gives us a place to anchor, to hook the blood vessels and the nerves onto it. It's also where the ligaments and the tendons are going to attach. Okay, it has an inner cell layer that has these cells that it has bone cells in it, and we'll talk about those in a minute. Okay, and I'm not worried about perforating fibers. Okay, so there's a picture of periosteum. Okay, so there's a fibrous outer layer. There's a layer that has cells, and then there are perforating fibers that are going to attach to the hard part of the bone. Okay, so this, remember that the slide that looks like the tree trunk? Okay, and it's got the bone cells. Okay, so these are bone cells. So those are actually what we call osteocytes. Okay, and then here's the compact bone. And then here, there's a, actually, it's just, there's a layer outside of that. Okay, now you guys remember, or you might not know, okay, so anytime you see osteo, you're gonna think bone. Okay, anytime you see chondro, you're gonna think cartilage. Okay, now inside the bone, we have what's called endosteum, right? So endo is inside, okay, and it's gonna line the medullary cavity. Okay, and it also has bone cells in it. And we're gonna talk about what these bone cells are here in a couple minutes. Okay, so endosteum is inside. You don't have to know what that looks like. Don't worry about that. Okay, now, gross anatomy of other bone classes. So we talked about the gross anatomy of a long bone. Okay, so we talked about all those parts of a long bone. So if you have a flat bone, okay, the external part is compact bone and the internal part is the spongy bone. They've given the spongy bone in the flat bones of the skull a special name, so diploe. Okay, and these bones don't have a medullary cavity. Okay, so here's kind of, if you took the skull and you cut a layer through it, you'd have the periosteum on the outside. Okay, there's compact bone, and then here's the spongy bone. Okay, now bone, it's alive. It's actually alive, right? You have to remember that because you think of it as something that's not really alive. Okay, so it can be highly vascularized. So that means it has lots of blood vessels, right? And the spongy bone has lots of blood vessels. So the blood vessels are going to enter from the outside from the periosteum. Okay, there are these holes in it. So anytime you see foramen, okay, foramen means hole. Foramen is a hole. Okay, so a nutrient foramen is a small opening in bone, and arteries and veins can enter and exit there. The nerves can also go through there. Okay, the nerves are mainly sensory nerves. Okay, now bone marrow. Okay, so bone marrow, there's two different kinds. So there's red and there's yellow. Okay, and red bone marrow is where we make red blood cells, where we make blood cells. Okay, so we make red blood cells, we make white blood cells, we can make platelets. Okay, so blood cells is good. Okay, now there's reticular. Well, okay, so in the bone marrow, the tissue is reticular. The blood cells can be immature, and there's also fat in there. Okay, so in kids, all right, red bone marrow's found in the spongy bone and in the medullary cavities of the long bone. In adults, we only find it in certain areas of the axial skeleton. Okay, so we find it in the skull. can find it in the vertebrae. It's in the ribs. Okay, it can be in the sternum and the os coxae. Okay, so the hips. Okay, it can be found in the epiphysis, the proximal ones, the ones closer to the body, the torso of the humerus and the femur. Okay, now yellow bone marrow is what happens when the red bone marrow degenerates as we age. Okay, so it becomes kind of fatty. I don't know if you guys eat meat and you think about bones and what's inside of a bone, right? Sometimes if you think about a marrow bone, okay, think about what's inside there. It could be a fat bone, right? It can be very, very fatty. Okay, now if someone's severely anemic, their body may try to put it back into make red bone marrow and put red bone marrow there so that you can start making more red blood cells. Okay, so your body's trying to keep you in equilibrium and make sure you have enough oxygen. So it could convert back to red bone marrow. Okay, so this is trying to show you this picture in an adult. Okay, all these places that look red have red bone marrow in them. Okay, so there's red bone marrow, and then there's some yellow in the middle. Like I buy marrow bones for my dogs, and they're just full of yellow bone marrow. And I guess if you get a good one, it might have some red in it too. Okay, so now bone marrow transplant. So if they're doing a bone marrow transplant to someone, what they usually do is they're going to go in and they're going to destroy the bone marrow that somebody already has. Okay, so they're going to destroy it with radiation and chemotherapy. So it destroys the immune system, is what they're saying. It takes everything out. And then they're going to take the harvested cells or the bone marrow from a donor, right? And they put them into the bloodstream of the recipient, and then they migrate to the places where red bone marrow normally is, and then it gets reestablished. They have to match. Okay, so the donor and the recipient have to match. So they do bone marrow transplants in cases of leukemia. So, or could be other autoimmune things. Okay, so leukemia is cancer of white blood cells. Okay, so the white blood cells are not getting produced properly. So something is wrong with the cells that are making them, which are found in the bone marrow. So if they can get rid of the bad ones and put in some good ones, it can cure it. Okay, now we're going to skip that. We're going to skip that. I meant to delete those. Okay, now if we look at the microscopic anatomy, okay, we're going to look at the types of cells that are actually in the bone. And I have it, each one of these has a slide. Okay, so bone is made up of cells and the stuff that's around the cells. Okay, so there's 4 types of cells. So we have osteoprogenitor, osteoblasts, osteocytes, and osteoclasts. Okay, and they kind of go like, well, I'll show you. Okay, so osteoprogenitor cells are, if we start with the stem cell, okay, a stem cell has the possibility to become any kind of cell. Okay, the next step for bone is these osteoprogenitor cells. So osteoprogenitor cells are like infants. Okay, so these are cells that they're committed to becoming bone cell. Okay, now they're found in the periosteum and the endosteum, and that's okay. I just want you to know what they are. Okay, now osteoblasts are important because these are the ones that are building bone. Okay, so B and B. Okay, so these ones are going to become osteocytes, which I have that written here. I don't need it. Okay, so they're going to develop into osteocytes. They are going to form bone. Okay, now osteocytes are mature bone cells. Okay, so they're going to say, okay, we need to make new bone, or we just need to maintain. So osteoblasts, I always remember B comes before C. Okay, so osteoblasts give rise to osteocytes. Okay, now osteoclasts are different. Okay, so osteoclasts are ones that are involved in resorption. Okay, so what does that mean? Okay, what that means is these are actually, so it says large multinuclear phagocytic cells. So they, what they do is they break down bone. Okay, so if you think about your body, okay, and bone is living, okay, so you're always building bone, you're always laying down bone. At the same time, okay, so if you think about it, if you're always building bone, and you would be huge and your skeleton would be really, really heavy if you never took anything away. So what your body does is it builds bone, and at the same time, it's breaking the bone on the inside down. Okay, so you're building it up and breaking it down at the same time, so you can kind of maintain equilibrium. Okay, so here's osteoprogenitor, there's osteoblast, there's an osteocyte, and then over here is the osteoclast, which is going to start breaking it down. Okay, now osteocytes, let's try to find the picture. Osteocytes, okay, are in here. They're going to be found in these circles. All right, let me go back and I'll start at the beginning of this, and it'll hopefully make sense. Okay, now bone is made up of two different kinds of materials. Okay, so it has organic and it has inorganic materials. Okay, so the organic stuff, okay, is collagen, protein, and then it's this other stuff, which is proteoglycans and glycoproteins. Okay, so what the organic part does is it allows the bone to actually be a little bit flexible. Okay, so it's not brittle. It allows it to be flexible. Okay, so it's got collagen proteins in it, and it's got proteoglycans and glycoproteins. Okay, now inorganically, you would be able to guess what it has, right? So it's got calcium phosphate in it. Okay, so calcium phosphate interacts with calcium hydroxide. It forms crystals. It also has calcium carbonate. It has sodium, magnesium sulfate, fluoride in there. Okay, so the crystals, the hard part, get formed around the collagen. Okay, and that forms the hard part of the bone. And I can post, Thanksgiving is coming. This is I have a little exercise you can do where you can heat up the bone and you break down. If you heat the bone up, you break down the proteins. So heat will break down the proteins and bone becomes brittle. Okay, but if you put bone in vinegar, okay, that breaks down the calcium, removes the calcium, and the bone becomes very flexible. Okay, so it's kind of cool. There's a little activity I can post for you guys to try it. Okay, now, how do we make bone? Okay, so it begins with the secretion of the osteoid, and then it calcifies. Okay, it's going to require vitamin D so that we can absorb calcium, vitamin C so we can form collagen, and you need calcium and phosphate for it to calcify. Okay, so bone is always reabsorbed. Okay, so it's kind of like it's a cycle, right? So we're building bone up and we're breaking it down. So remember, osteoclasts are what's going to break it down. They know the process of how it's broken down. I'm not too worried that you guys know all of that. Okay, but I want you to know that the calcium and the phosphate from breaking the bone down are going to enter the blood and they're going to get recycled. Okay, when blood calcium is low, okay, we're going to break down bone in order to try to increase the amount of calcium that we have. Okay, so we're trying to stay in homeostasis. And if we have a calcium store in our bone and we need calcium, we're going to break down the bone to try to get it. And that's what can lead to osteoporosis. Don't worry about this. I meant to delete this, so don't worry about that. But that's the clinical things are cool and they're in the book. But I just want to make sure that you guys are getting the normal before you start getting the abnormal. Okay, so compact bone is made of these cylindrical structures. So these like tree trunks. Okay, and the tree trunks are called osteons. And we used to call them Herversian systems. Okay, but now the proper name is osteons. Okay, so here they say bullseye, right? I always think it looks like a tree trunk that's been cut up. Okay, so if we look at an osteon, what you're gonna see, okay, so this circle thing, let me try to find a color that will show up on here. Is that, you can't see that. What about orange? Okay, so here, this is considered an osteon. Okay, now, the anatomy of the osteon. Okay, so what you're gonna have is you're gonna have perforating fibers coming in from the outside. Okay, so there are also perforating canals. And in those canals, that's where the blood is going to, the arteries are gonna enter and the veins are gonna leave. Okay, so that's how we're getting the blood supply to and from the little osteocytes. Okay, so the osteocytes, if you look at an osteon here, okay, so here's, this is the osteon, the circle. Okay, these are the cells, these are the osteocytes. And coming from them are little canals. So nutrients can flow through these canals to the different cells. Okay, in the middle, it's called the central canal, and you'll find blood vessels there. Okay, the circles, these are called concentric lamellae. All right, I don't know if that makes sense. So if you took a femur or a long bone and you cut it, okay, here's spongy bone, okay, and then here are all the osteons. The osteocytes are the cells, okay, the canaliculi are just the little canals that are going to connect them. Okay, now, spongy bone has it's kind of like a lattice work inside. So lattice or sponge, and it's called trabeculae. Okay, and in the spaces is where you're going to have bone marrow. So the trabeculae are going to help keep the bone from breaking. Okay, spongy bone also has parallel lamellae. Okay, and the osteocytes are going to be between them. So if you look here, okay, here are the trabeculae. Okay, so that's just the mesh. And then you're going to see the cells within there. We spend way more time learning the osteon model of compact bone than this. Okay, so don't worry about that. Okay, now, things about hyaline cartilage. Okay, so hyaline cartilage is really clear. Okay, so it has proteins, proteoglycans in it, but it doesn't have calcium in it. It's pretty tough and it's flexible. It has a lot of water. It's avascular, so no blood vessels, and it doesn't have any nerves. Okay, so now don't worry about that. I should have got rid of that. Okay, now when we make bone, it's called ossification, or sometimes they call it osteogenesis. Okay, and there's two different kinds of it. Okay, so the skeleton forms either from intermembranous ossification or endochondral ossification. Okay, so let's just start with that. Okay, two different ways you can form bone. Okay, intermembranous ossification makes the bones of the skull, the facial bones, the mandible, and the clavicle, which is like your can't think of the collarbone. Okay, so what it does, I don't usually make them memorize this. Okay, so don't worry about memorizing this. Okay, I just want you to know it exists. Okay, intermembranous ossification. So, and I don't expect you to learn the steps. Okay, yeah, don't worry about it. Okay, now endochondral ossification. Okay, I want you to go understand. Okay, so it produces most of the bones of the skeleton. Okay, so the example that we give is how a long bone is formed. Okay, so when you have a fetus, okay, it starts to form bone from hyaline cartilage. Okay, so what happens is chondroblasts, okay, so baby cartilage cells start secreting this cartilage, okay, and that's in the 8th to 12th week of development. Okay, what happens is that the cartilage will then calcify. Okay, and as the cartilage calcifies, okay, the chondrocytes die. Okay, so you start to have like a framework for the bone to be formed. Okay, then the blood vessels will grow towards the cartilage and then we'll start to develop osteoblasts. Okay, so the osteoblasts are the baby bone cells. Okay, now what will happen, okay, is we form this thing called a primary ossification center. I'm not worried about that. I'm not worried about that. What I want you to get is that the bone is going to extend, okay, from this primary ossification center. Let me try to find a picture. Not that one. Not that one. Shoot. Okay, so we look at this. Okay, so in the bone, okay, here's your epiphyseal plate. Okay, in there, what you're going to find, okay, is that you have these 5 zones. Okay, so you have a zone of resting cartilage. You have a zone of proliferating cartilage, so the cartilage is reproducing. You have a zone where the cartilage cells are starting to get bigger. Okay, and then what happens is it starts to calcify. Okay, and when it starts to calcify, then it'll start to make bone. Okay, so this is happening in these spaces here. And they know all of these steps about it, right? They know exactly what's going to trigger it, how the cells are communicating with each other. I just want you to get the idea that the bones are growing from the metaphysis, okay, so from this epiphyseal plate. Okay, so what happens is the bone's going to replace the cartilage, okay, and then it's going to lengthen. I should have looked at this better. I used the things from the textbook, and it's not, I should have used the stuff I had before. I'll look for a video that somebody else has made that explains it with some animations. Okay. So I'll find something better to to explain it to you, because I feel like I'm kind of butchering it. So if we go back and look at this one more time, I want you to know that there are two ways that bone is going to grow, right? So the first one is going to do flat bones, and that's the intramembranous ossification. The other one is the endochondral ossification, which is how the long bones grow and how most bones grow. Okay, and it's all based on this idea of the cartilage, and the cartilage is going to make space, and this cartilage cells are going to grow, and then we're going to lay down calcification. We're going to calcify around them. Okay, I'll find an animation. Okay, now, I already talked about epiphyseal plate. So here's a child's hands, and they colorized this x-ray. Okay, so here's the fingers. So there's the diaphysis, and then you can see the epiphyseal plates you can see space, right? Can you see that in here? And that's going to fuse once they stop growing. Okay, so forensic anthropology, so a forensic anthropologist is someone that looks at bones, right? And tries to figure out, is it a male, is it a female? Can they figure out the ethnicity? Can they figure out the age? Okay, so they'll they can look at how the epiphyseal plate is fused and determine the age. Okay, now in bone, we also have appositional growth. Okay, so what's going to happen is our bone, as we age, okay, it's going to get broader, okay, but we're going to break it down along the middle so that we don't get our bone mass doesn't get too much. Okay, we can get appositional growth if we start doing something that requires some sort of repetitive weight-bearing exercise. Okay, we can develop more appositional growth once we start doing something else, even if we're a grown-up. Okay, so bone remodeling is the idea, so it continues throughout adulthood. Okay, so it's gonna get laid down on the outside and it's gonna get broken down on the inside. Okay, so the distal part of the femur, it says, is replaced every 4 to 6 months, okay, but the diaphysis we keep our whole life. Okay, so it really depends on the activities of the osteoblast, the osteocytes, and the osteoclast, and that's all influenced by hormones, okay, so by estrogen and progesterone and testosterone, as well as a couple that we're going to talk about, a couple more that we're going to talk about, and mechanical stress and stress that you put onto the bone. Okay, so if you're doing weightlifting or you start a new job where you're digging ditches, okay, you're going to be strengthening, thickening the bones for the muscles that you're using to move the shovel, compared to me where I'm sitting at my desk. Okay, so those bones are breaking down. Okay, so mechanical stress. Okay, so it occurs in weight-bearing exercise or movement. Okay, you have to have it for bones to constantly remodel. We get increased bone mass from weight-bearing activities. Okay, now what are the hormones that are going to control this? Okay, and you guys know what a hormone is. Okay, so let's keep going. Okay, so one is growth hormone. Okay, so growth hormone, somatotropin, is produced by the anterior pituitary gland, and it causes the liver to produce this thing called somatomedin. Okay, and they're going to stimulate the growth of the cartilage in the epiphyseal plate. Okay, thyroid hormone is going to increase the metabolic rate of the bone cells. Okay, the sex hormones, okay, the estrogen and testosterone are going to really increase bone growth. Okay, so they increase the rate of cartilage formation and then bone formation. Okay, now glucocorticoids. Okay, so these are steroids that are coming from your adrenal cortex. if you have a high level of stress hormones, okay, it'll impair growth at the epiphyseal plate. It'll slow it down. So if a child is receiving high doses of steroids, okay, it could inhibit their growth. Okay, serotonin is another one. Okay, so serotonin, I don't usually talk about serotonin too much. Okay, so it's, yeah, don't worry about it. Not worry about serotonin. Okay, now, how do we regulate blood calcium levels? Okay, so we have to regulate how much calcium is in your blood. Okay, so calcium is going to be important for muscle contractions. Okay, it's also important for when neurons fire. Okay, it's going to keep your heart beating properly. It's also going to make sure your blood clots right. Okay, two hormones that primarily regulate blood calcium are calcitriol and parathyroid hormone. Okay, so calcitriol comes from vitamin D. Okay, so UV light, so sunlight, is going to convert 7-dehydrocholesterol to vitamin D3. Okay, it gets released into the blood and it gets absorbed from your diet. Okay, so D3 circulates throughout your body and it gets converted to calcidiol. Okay, so they occur at the same time. Calcidiol circulates in the blood and it gets converted to calcitriol by enzymes from the kidney. Okay, parathyroid hormone increases the rate of conversion, so we get more calcitriol. Calcitriol is going to stimulate absorption of blood calcium ions from the small intestine into the blood. Okay, so here's a picture of it. Okay, so here is the precursor molecule, and you need sunlight. Okay, sunlight comes down, right? Or you're getting it from your diet. Okay, so we can make it, vitamin D3, or we can drink it or eat it. Okay, so we get this vitamin D3 calciferol. Okay, and then that gets converted to calcidiol. Okay, and that gets converted to calcitriol. Okay, so skin is important, right, because of the sun. Okay, and the liver and the kidneys. Okay, now, hold on a minute. It's okay. Hold on, I can stop.